On today's episode of Locked On Lightning, we continue our player reviews. And on today's episode, we're talking about Lightning defenseman Victor Hedman. How did his season go? What do we predict for him for next season, as well as expectations? All that coming up and more on Locked On Lightning.
You're Locked On Lightning, your daily podcast on the Tampa Bay Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to another episode of Locked On Lightning, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Adam Danker. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Locked On Lightning. Just a reminder, today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code Locked On NHL for $20 off your first purchase. On today's episode of Locked On Lightning, we're talking about Victor Hedman, taking a look back on his season, as well as taking a look forward to next season, as well as some expectations we have for next year. But before we get into any of those topics, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form. We're also available on YouTube, so go ahead, subscribe to our channel there. Hit that notification button and drop a comment below. You can find more of my work over at boltbythebay.com. I actually put up an article little before recording this episode discussing possible landing spots for Steven Stamkos this offseason. Go ahead and check that article out. It is posted on my Twitter at DankyDank, DENKYD8NK. So I want to say I've been having a great time doing all these player reviews, and it really brings back just not so much the memories that we have from this offseason with some players. It's more so how I think especially mine at least, my mood and my way of thinking about certain players has changed throughout the course of the year. And it really tells you just how awesome of the progression and evolution of an NHL season is. We talked about it in the Jonas Johansson episode, the Andre Vasilevsky episode. Some of you brought it up with the episode we did the other day with Braden Point about, just the Lightning not really getting off to an ideal start on the season. Obviously, March was their best, probably the pinnacle of their season. And just, the peaks and valleys that is the NHL season especially for the Lightning this year. And with Victor Hedman, there's no exceptions there, because we were, especially myself on this show, we're talking a lot about how really Victor Hedman looked really old out there to start this season, defensively at least. And even then the points weren't that impressive. And it's crazy to think about looking back on that. And yes, some of you might be saying, well, he didn't really have that good of a season defensively. Yeah, I mean, I think, though, towards the end of the season, we kind of saw him making those plays here and there that I think that we hadn't seen in probably a couple of seasons last year. He didn't really... We really thought that the clock was really ticking on him. I mean, he just did not have a good season last year on any side of the ice. And then this season, kind of to start off, a little bit more of the same. But, the big thing with him that I think has always been a big part of his game and has really separated himself defensively from other blue liners in the NHL is that his ability to track down puck handlers from opposite sides of the ice, even to outskate certain individuals that may necessarily be faster than him. And we haven't seen that. And it's all about, the angles you take and all of that stuff. But with him, we didn't see that. And then towards the end of the season, you started to see it here and there. It wasn't as often, and it wasn't it wasn't like we were getting one spectacular play from him a game. But you know what? That's what we've come to expect from him in his time in Tampa Bay. And I think when you take a look at the other side of the ice from him and how you were feeling at that point, such as I was, especially in the first 2 months of the season, even going into Christmas, I was not particularly happy with his performance at all on any side. But when you look at his stats now, you know, the numbers don't lie. And, you know, if you've been a listener of this podcast, at least for this season, you know I'm huge on the eye test. You know, I always say, don't judge a player until you see him play. You know, don't judge a player strictly based off of their stats and all of that. And that goes for everybody. That goes for the Eric Chernaks as well as all the way up to Nikita Kucherov. But when you look at Victor Hedman's season, you look at his stats, it's almost confusing to say or to look back on how you felt to start the season and look back and see all that and then see his numbers, 78 games played, 13 goals, 76 points. It's almost a point a game. And it's wild to think about because he's only 2 years removed from his best offensive season. He played a full season, 82 games, 20 goals, 85 points. And that was, I think, in my opinion, you know, I mean, if you want to pick the years where he finished in the top 3 in the Norris or even in the year he won the Norris, I still think regardless, I think 2021-22 was his best season by far. Just because he was playing defense and he was scoring a ton. And so when you look back on his season and it's confusing because you weren't overly impressed, but yet he was not far off his career highs, you should be rightfully confused. And I was confused too, but you know what? When you look at going into this offseason as well as next season, he's going to be on the last year of his deal. And you know, as soon as Stamkos signs the dotted line back in Tampa Bay or somewhere else, all attention is going to turn towards Victor Hedman. And I think that, you know, I don't want to say that his time here in Tampa Bay was any less important than Stamkos's. But I think that to a certain degree, a certain extent, the Lightning would not go as far to bring back Stamkos if he's expecting, I mean, wouldn't go as far to bring back Hedman if he was expecting Stamkos money. Especially if Stamkos gets a lot and stays in Tampa Bay. But I think that, though, when you look back, and that's a whole nother conversation that we'll have in the second segment because there's a lot of things that go into that. But I think as a whole, I think this is a very good sign for the Lightning and for Victor Hedman. Obviously, Victor Hedman wants to stay in Tampa Bay for the rest of his career. The Lightning, on the other hand, you know, they're trying to figure out what they should do with the roster. Got Ryan McDonough back. Sergachev's going to be back in the lineup. He's going to be healthy. Chernak is a question mark in terms of the future. You know, you still have him, but, you know, what are you going to do with him in that regard with his no trade clause? And then you have a few other spots to fill here and there. Darren Radish will be back. Nick Pervix might be back by default just because they may not be able to go out and get anybody else. But if I'm in the Lightning front office, I would be very pleased by how the season ended for Victor Hedman. Obviously, with everything that we've been talking about on the player reviews, his lack there of performance, I don't blame it too much on him, as like I wouldn't blame it on too much on anyone per se. just because you don't know what he's being told on the bench. You don't know how he's being told how to play. His unimpressive defense this year, I think a lot of Lightning fans would agree with me when I say that most likely it had to do with defensive schemes. A lot of talk has been had about Jeff Blashill, what he's been doing or possibly not doing. John Cooper, too, as well. I grouped the two together because that's his buddy. Brought him in. Didn't have a good season defensively. And, obviously as a coach, you are responsible of where the ship steers into, whether it be shallow, rocky waters or smooth waters. You're responsible for what happens, and I view I have the same mentality with John Cooper, and I think that next year, I think that now that we're going into year 2 of Jeff Blashill and all that, I think that adjustments will be made across the board. I think that also that it's going to be a very telling year for Victor Hedman because. Now we know that not only he could still put up the numbers, but offensively, but can he still play defense at a high level? Like a first line defenseman. Like a guy that on a lot of teams in this league would be wearing the captaincy. And we'll talk about that because, now the question has to be asked at this point in his career. 33 going on 34. He'll be 34 in December. Defenseman, you maybe add on a couple of more years to that age. Will we see a decline out of him? We'll talk about that coming up in a bit. But really, to wrap it up, I mean, a very good year for him. And I think if I was going to give, all things considered, to give a grade for him, I would probably say a solid B, just based off the offense. My thing that comes into it, though, is I want to see more of a footprint with him with the defense. So let me know in the comments below. I mean, I've tried very hard to not completely bash anyone on these player reviews, just because there are bigger things at play than guys just not performing. There are schemes being put out that maybe don't necessarily work. There are variables like maybe not even being used the right way. If you go back and listen to all the player reviews, you'll see a common theme with mostly every player. So coming up in just a little bit, we're going to talk about his decline. When is it coming? Because it's going to come at some point. I mean, you saw it with Wayne Gretzky. Once he left Edmonton, even when he was in LA towards the end, after that, he had great performances, but he was never the same great elite player that he was in Edmonton. If you don't believe me, look at his stats. But it happens to everyone. That's the main message. So we'll talk about that coming up in just a little bit. But first, we're going to talk about our first sponsor on today's show, and that is our friends over at Game Time. Now, listen up. I love sporting events. I love going to baseball games. I live in New York, so, we have a lot of things around. Theater, comedy shows, all that fun stuff. And I live in a city where you spend money by just leaving your house. And in today's world, it's everywhere. And so you got to save as much money as you can. And I do it with Game Time. Now, Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace for Major League Baseball. It's baseball season, baby. Hockey season might be coming to a close tonight. Basketball season's over, so it's baseball. And Game Time's going to make getting tickets faster and easier. The prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to the first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets. They have these amazing deals. You could save up to 60% off buying last minute for sports, concert, comedy, theater, etc. I love also their seat view features where you could get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. And they also have the lowest price guarantee. You get the lowest price on the ticket, or Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets or any tickets this summer with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. So as always, I want to thank you all for making us your first listen of the day. If you haven't already done so, please go ahead and subscribe to the podcast. Give us a follow wherever podcasts are distributed in audio form are also available on YouTube. You could catch some more of my work outside of the podcast at boltsbythebay.com. So we just got done. I just did an article today about possible landing spots for Steven Stamkos in anticipation of tomorrow's episode that we'll be putting out, player review. It'll be the last one. We're putting out one later tonight too as well. Nikita Kucherov, and then tomorrow it's going to be Stamkos, of course. So definitely check those out and check out that article at boltsbythebay.com. So at every point when you're evaluating a player in his career, especially when he's in his early to mid 30s, you got to start having the conversation. I know we hate having it, especially with players that we really like, especially, with Stamkos and Hedman, and then someday eventually Kucherov and Point and Paul. One has to wonder, especially with all this money, millions of dollars being thrown around, and that's the conversation that I guarantee you was probably being had with the Lightning front office when it comes to Stamkos, and it will definitely be had, whether it be this season or next summer with Victor Hedman. When will the decline happen? Because it happens. It happens with everybody. Like I said, if you don't believe me, go look at Wayne Gretzky's numbers. Once he left Edmonton, he was not the same player. He had his flashes of brilliance, his flashes of greatness, but he wasn't godlike, I think, anymore. And I don't think when it comes to Victor Hedman, we will see, this is a weird thing to say, but it seems like everything trending the way it is. I think when you're talking about decline with Victor Hedman, I think you have to not so much look at the offensive side of things, because I think in today's league, not so much that the goaltending is bad. I think it's probably at the best it's been since really the late 90s, early 2000s. But I think that the offense is so much better. The players are so much faster. The shots are just consistently harder and faster and all that stuff, to where really goaltenders just sometimes, we see it with Vasilevsky, we see it with Hellebuck, we see it with Bobrovsky. Sometimes there are just shots that just nobody could really save. But when we're talking about decline with Victor Hedman, I think that really what it comes down to it is that I don't think we're going to necessarily see it offensively, but we will see it defensively. And when you're talking about the Lightning and everything being tight, and things will start to open up with the cap in the next couple of years. The salary cap's going up this year. It'll go up the year after, and the year after, and the year after. But you still don't want to spend money recklessly. I mean, we've spoken about that coming into this offseason before the McDonough trade, that the Lightning for the first time had a little bit of cushion. And just because you had the money doesn't necessarily mean you have to spend it foolishly. And that's why you have to take every little step you can to do your due diligence in order to put yourself as a franchise in the best position possible. Because you don't want to be giving guys like Hedman, who are going to be 34, you don't want to be giving these guys 4 or 5 year contracts $6 million annual, and then the guy is basically a liability in 2 years. And I think with defensemen, I think that really, unfortunately, you got to expect it sooner rather than later. I mean, best recent example was Zdeno Chara. His last couple of years in Boston, and then with the Islanders, the guy, I mean, I was there for his last career game against the Lightning. That was the night that Steven Stamkos scored a hat trick, last game of the season before they ended up losing to the Maple Leafs in the first round a couple of years ago. The guy was a statue out there, and I don't want it to get to that point with Victor Hedman, and I think we won't see that. I think that those two obviously play somewhat different games, but defensemen, they take on a whole lot more miles just because they play a little bit more minutes. And I think that really what it comes down to is that we should expect the decline maybe to come at the end of this season. And I think, unfortunately, that's why maybe the storyline immediately started right after the playoffs that, once Stamkos gets done, now we look at Hedman. And I think that's more so Hedman's people kind of saying, let's get something done now while his value is still up, while he is coming off probably the second best offensive season he's had in his career. Let's get him locked up so, his value doesn't go down. And that's definitely a big thing that we'll have to keep an eye out for this upcoming season with Victor Hedman. I think that really once Stamkos gets done or decides to depart, or option 3 retires, because that's definitely something that can happen, I wouldn't be surprised if Hedman's people, as soon as the ink hits the paper for Stamkos, or if once we get a definitive decision, the conversation immediately within minutes online turns to Victor Hedman. But in my opinion, I think that the Lightning can live with a depleted Victor Hedman defensively as long as he's paired up in a responsible way, something that we have not seen, quite honestly. As for who that might be, I really liked how him and Darren Radish played with each other last year. I think also Darren Radish is one of those players that he could become a very solid two-way defenseman. I don't think he's going to put up the offensive numbers that we'll see out of that we have seen out of Victor Hedman. But I could definitely see him being a first-line defenseman that would be very solid and complement Victor Hedman. I don't think it was responsible at all, and I think the Lightning realized that a little later than they should have, that you shouldn't have Eric Chernak or Nick Pervix on a line with Victor Hedman, especially when he's not really what he is supposed to be. So let me know in the comments below. I mean, yeah, it's not a very nice conversation to have, but it's a conversation that is yet very necessary to have, especially when you're talking about a player that is going into the last year of his contract. So let me know in the comments below. I mean, like I said, we might see it end of next year. We might see it the season after. We might see it from night 1 this season. It could be a simple situation like Stamkos. Stamkos looked kind of washed up at times last year, and then he kind of changed things up and how he played. And look, now we're talking about him coming off a 40-goal season. So it could be the same thing for Victor Hedman. Maybe he just needs to embrace that offensive role, which I would not be upset about one bit, as long as, like I said, he is matched up with a line mate that could play defense and hold it down. So let me know in the comments below, what are your thoughts on that? And coming up, as we always do with player reviews, we wrap things up with expectations for the following season. But first, we're going to wrap it up with our last sponsor on today's show, and that is our friends at the Ultimate Hockey GM. Now, Lightning fans, I want to take a moment to bring one of our partners, the mobile game, Ultimate Hockey GM, the best mobile hockey game out there for anyone ever out there. I don't care what you say. Ultimate Hockey GM is the place to be, the place to kill time this summer. Have you ever dreamed of becoming an NHL GM and managing your hockey franchise? Do you think you could run the Lightning better than Julian Brees-Boss can? Well, your dream can come true, and this game is most definitely for you. Manage every strategic aspect of your team, play through the seasons, and lead it to glory. Hire the right coaches, staff, trade players, or draft picks. Navigate through free agency and the draft, all in a challenging and realistic game world. As a Lightning fan, you know there is no offseason. GMs are constantly making moves at every point of the year to improve their team's chances, and that's why I think you are going to love this game. I've been playing this game ever since they partnered up with it. Actually, I was playing this game before they became our sponsors on the show, and I absolutely love it, and you will too. So Locked On listeners right now get a 100% free boost to their franchise when they use the promo code Locked On NHL in the game store. So make sure to check it out. Download the game. Visit hockeygm.app. That's hockeygm.app, or look it up in the app stores. Ultimate Hockey GM. Start your dynasty today. So real quick, I want to let you know that, like I said, we'll be going ahead and dropping another episode later today. That will be on Nikita Kucherov, so keep an eye out for that. And then tomorrow we will wrap up our player reviews with Steven Stamkos. And then starting next week, and really taking us all the way up to the beginning of training camp for the rest of the summer, we'll be taking a look back at the 2004 Stanley Cup run, all the way from the first series all the way to the ending buzzer against the Flames in the Stanley Cup final. We did one during the pandemic a couple of years ago. That was strictly the Stanley Cup final, but we are doing every playoff game. We're going to be treating it as if these games are happening in real time. So make sure to tune in for those and join us along. We'll be talking about that all summer long, celebrating 20 years since the Lightning won their first Stanley Cup. And make sure to go ahead and hit the notification button if you're listening to us on an app-based platform, because as soon as those episodes drop, you'll be notified. So go ahead and do that. So real quick, before we wrap things up, expectations real quick, very simple for Victor Hedman. Stay healthy, which for the most part he has done. Would just like to see defense, just would like to see him play consistently good defense. I'm not expecting, highlight reel plays here, honestly. I would prefer just average defensive play and good offense at this point, if that's what we're going to get. I just don't want it to turn into a situation with him where he is just a one-way defenseman, just strictly offensive and just a complete liability defensively. I honestly don't want that. And if that's what it's going to be, then maybe the Lightning should shop him and see what they could get for him. I know that sounds blasphemous, but listen, it's that time of year. It's and you saw with the Rangers the other day, they put Barclay Goodrow on waivers, and it was something that no team would ever dream about doing, and the Lightning did it themselves. They traded him to New York, but at the same time, it's one of those things where really you got to do what you got to do if you want to stay competitive. At the end of the day, this is a business. And I think that, there's really, in this day and age, especially if you're trying to stay competitive, there's really no player, at least for the Lightning. I'm not going to speak for any other team in the NHL, but, it's one of those things where, there's no such thing as an untradeable player, unless they actually are, full no trade clause. But that's a whole nother thing. And I'm sure teams could get around that if they really wanted to, if they were really desperate to trade away a player. But yeah, I would think that we're going to get somewhere close to what he had last year offensively. 15 goals and 75 points or something a little under that. That's fine. Decent defense, like I said. And that's it. That's really all I could ask out of him. 82 games and just lead by example. The one thing I will say, and then we'll wrap it up there. The one thing I will say, and it's not so much his fault, I think this is more of a scheme issue, is that when you look back on the Stanley Cup runs, especially the year he won the Conn Smythe, that his biggest strength was scoring, and that was particularly from the slot area. And I think that we need to see more of that. And we saw it a little bit here and there throughout the stretch. We saw it the last stretch of the season, as well as here and there in that playoff series against the Panthers, him taking shots. I want to see 2 shots a game from the slot, and that's it. And I think it's very possible, and something that we should. I never understood why they got away from that. Maybe so because, turnovers and his ability to get back on defense and hunt down puck carriers on the breakaway. So let me know in the comments below your thoughts about this past season for Victor Hedman, next season for him, expectations, all that fun stuff, and join us a little later on as we continue our player review with Nikita Kucherov. So that's been it for this episode of Locked On Lightning, part of Locked On Podcast Network. I'm your host, Adam Danker. I'll talk to you in the next one.